Good morning on Thursday, December the 8th. Just want to make a few comments to get some ideas out there and get your response as I'm thinking about American foreign policy and the things that we've done over the last several decades. And as I've kind of thought about things in the background and generally been supportive of the way America's handled herself on the world stage. In part because I didn't pay a whole lot of attention, I guess, or not enough attention to what we were doing and what the arguments were for doing it. It just seemed that, we were defending the right and going against those who were wrong, um, much like the storyline today for the Ukraine conflict with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Putin's actions. But I've been thinking over the years, actually had some nagging doubts about our policy, particularly as we're a nation that uh, is founded on ideals that took centuries and millennia to arrive at in finding their expression in the American Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and that continue to be a struggle to find their expression in how, in fact, we organize society and live our lives as a people, a free people, and a nation based on law, but law that is dependent upon a basic moral framework or perspective whereby the law is essentially simply affirming the lives that are being lived in a morally good on an ethical basis, um, for reasons that we'll talk about or alluded to in other videos. And everything I'm going to mention here in the next few minutes will merit additional discussion and hopefully information from you all to help me think about things that, frankly, in some cases, I don't have enough information to think about clearly. But still, I wonder about circumstances in light of the general principles that I have and that I think grew out of how I was raised to understand America was meant to be in the world, America's place in the world. And so, before I ramble too long, I just want to note that, for example, in the Ukraine conflict, I've listened to several of John Mearsheimer's speeches and a couple of question and answer sessions. And it seems to me that Mearsheimer's position has borne itself out and is proven to be true, that he's echoed for the last several, or last, not several, last few decades anyway, his realist position. And as I reflected on some of the things that have transpired post-Soviet Union, practically from the fall of the Soviet Union forward, uh, it strikes me that the most consistent player in all that's been going on perhaps has been Vladimir Putin. Now, I'm not a Putin apologist. I'm not suggesting that he is justified in invading Ukraine. But I am raising a question as to whether or not U.S. action in that particular context has been as above board as we would like to think, to the point that we feel justified in facilitating and perpetuating this conflict as we supply Ukraine with armaments and funds, and they supply lives and a whole social, political context, cities, the very structure of the nation, in the context of or in the face of Russia's onslaught. But I think one thing that it shows is what a red line actually means when somebody holds to it. That Russia and Putin have made their feelings about Ukraine and NATO and American involvement in Ukraine clear over the last several decades, whereas America has continued to push. And so, it's kind of like, and no pun intended with respect to this reference, but if you poke a bear with a stick often enough, is it the bear's fault if he finally turns around and strikes you? And so, as we reflect on actions that we could have taken versus the actions that we did take over the last several decades, I find it hard to excuse America's actions that have brought us to this point. And there are many aspects and many issues at play here, one of which, frankly, is the military industrial complex that is developed in the West. And, the fact that I don't remember the exact numbers. I'd have to go back and get them. I meant to do that before I got on here, but that America's military budget is larger than several of the nations combined that follow her on the list of expenditures for the military. That America has sent more aid to Ukraine than Russia's already in this conflict than Russia's entire annual military budget. There are some disproportionate factors involved, not only with respect to what the U.S. spends in military budget and expenditures, but I guess you might say, what we get out of it. And one aspect is that I keep hearing reports that in our support of Ukraine, we have nearly exhausted or on the verge of exhausting our backup supply, such that we would be in a difficult situation were a conflict to actually develop with China, or if the U.S. were to actually be directly involved in a conflict with Russia, or even, frankly, anybody else at this point. So I think there are a lot of things that ought to be reconsidered. And I'm speaking as a conservative from a conservative background and someone who's still personally very conservative, but who has perhaps more liberal public perspectives than many with whom I disagree, or I'm sorry, many with whom I agree when it comes to how personally we ought to live. And when it comes to how America has used her position as the sole superpower for the last few decades to perhaps foment and facilitate a context for war as opposed to a context for peace, I think we have a lot to answer for. The degree to which this conflict was totally unnecessary, could have been totally avoided, I think is a good starting point. Now, I think that both Democrat and Republican administrations and Congresses have a lot to answer for over the last several decades. I think that President Biden's time in office has been a pretty much a total disaster when it comes to foreign policy and actions, whether it's the Afghanistan withdrawal, not necessarily that we should or shouldn't have withdrawn from Afghanistan, but how in fact it was handled. The way things have been handled with Syria. I just saw a news report last night, which is one of the things that brought this whole topic front of mind again and front of mind, top of mind. I've been hearing that phrase since President Biden made a blunder and the press secretary, whose name Karine Jean-Pierre, made the reference top of mind. And for some reason, that phrase has been popping up in lots of reports lately. But anyway, saw some reports last night about China and Saudi Arabia making closer ties. Saudi Arabia perhaps joining China and Russia joining together in response to American support for, NATO support for, and perceived aggression in pursuing possible, again, a topic to be looked at later, Ukrainian membership in NATO. All these different streams come together, and it basically leaves me thinking that those of us who feel like we should have a strong defense, and those of us who feel like we should be, as a nation, the degree to which a nation can be, we should be a moral force for good in the world. I'm beginning to wonder if, in fact, our actual actions in the world over the last several decades and even today are reflective of that position, or if we've been bamboozled into thinking we are supporting causes for the good that in effect are net causes for evil, and perhaps were never fully clearly thought through with respect to how good ought to be pursued. in the context of being the sole superpower. So anyway, let me know what you think. Many of these topics I'll try to address and get more information on, and hopefully get more information from you on going forward. Thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.